This is the 25th Congressional District Democratic Primary Debate on News 8.
Welcome back, and thank you again for joining us. The next question is for City Council member Adam McFadden. Mr. McFadden, several years ago, you took on and resigned quickly from the post of interim executive director for the Rochester Housing Authority, with some claiming a conflict of interest. Was there anything significant learned from that situation?
Oh, absolutely. That's the reason why we started the source of income discrimination legislation for the city that Robin talked about, that they actually used my work to implement in Brighton. What happened was I asked for a map of where we were dispersing those Section 8 vouchers. And when I got that map back, you saw all our vouchers were being used in our most challenged communities in the city of Rochester, which actually is not the purpose of a Section 8 voucher. You look in a renter's guide to, back then, it would say no Section 8, no DSS, actually discriminating against people before they even saw their face. For me, that experience taught me a lot, because I got to see how we were dispersing those vouchers to people who needed them and keeping them in poverty, keeping them locked into generational poverty. For me, passing that law was important because it gave people an opportunity to go into what I would call areas of opportunity so that they could not be challenged by where they lived and have an opportunity to live in a better neighborhood that might be safe to raise their children, go to work, and shop.
Mr. Morelli, you're welcome to address this specific issue or poverty and housing in general.
Well, I continue to believe that affordable housing is critically important if we're going to address the issues of poverty. People who are faced in either impacted by poverty or in crisis have many, many challenges, and we need to address them all in a person-centered way. And what we find is that children and their families often have a whole host of problems that they're dealing with. It may not be a child who's struggling in school, may not be an educational issue at all, maybe a healthcare issue, maybe an issue related to family. Oftentimes it's an issue that relates to housing and the fact that they've moved several times in a period of months. I'm very proud of the fact that in terms of state dollars, Rochester has one of the greatest affordable housing group of people who are developing housing, not-for-profit housing, probably the best in the state. We've seen a significant number of increases, but those housing starts need to be tied to services, both educational, healthcare services, social services, and we need to integrate these services. What you see are too many silos. The silos don't talk to one another. People get moved around, they fall through the cracks. We're not gaining traction. That's why we have challenges in the city school district. That's why we have healthcare challenges. If we're going to address poverty, we have to do it in a redesign of the system that is integrated and that focuses on the individuals and their affected families.
Ms. Wilt.
I think right now there's a lack of conversation among the people who are the biggest stakeholders in this, the people who do suffer from housing insecurity. And that's why I have been on the streets with the people who suffer from housing insecurity, trying to find out what issues that they face and standing with them as they take on the status quo where we tend to subsidize gentrification and then do not provide enough affordable housing choices in our community. I don't know what Mr. Morelli is talking about when he's saying that we have one of the best systems of affordable housing in the state, because that is not what we witness on the streets. We witness people in situations of housing insecurity. We witness gentrification. We witness a situation where profits are prioritized over people.
Ms. Wilt, thank you. Ms. Barnhart.
2 points here. First, when the federal government came in Mr. McFadden's unfortunate situation, they were providing oversight over what was going on at the Rochester Housing Authority. And I'm uniquely qualified to, as your Congresswoman, look over how our federal dollars are being spent in our community. And over the past year, I learned that RHA spent tax dollars on a casino trip. I learned that the city of Rochester was using community development block grant funds to build a Morton Steakhouse downtown. This is highly inappropriate. And on the issue of affordable housing, I had the privilege of listening to Matthew Desmond, the author of Evicted, when he came to Rochester recently, and he talked about the devastating impact of housing instability on families, and he talked about what if we were to provide Section 8 vouchers to everyone. I think we need to move in that direction. That still doesn't solve the problem of the availability of units. And if you look at council legislation recently passed that provides the Southview Tower developer $2 million in a fee just to rehab the place, this is why it's so expensive to build these units, and this is a problem that states and cities are grappling with across the country, and it needs to be solved.
Mr. Morelli, Mr. McFadden addressed this just a few minutes ago. AIM Photonics, the promise was 100 jobs for scientists and other experts within the first 5 months, then thousands in the years to come. That was in 2015. Did the federal government and the state oversell all this?
Well, look, I think photonics is a potentially breakthrough technology which will employ thousands of people in this region. That's why we've brought in RIT, University of Rochester, universities in California and Arizona to work on this. I think whenever you have new technology, there is a period at which you're trying to grow that. We're developing a cluster. I met with photonics companies last week. Whenever you involve new technology, there are going to be winners and losers potentially. There's no guarantees. But if you're going to take the entrepreneurial spirit which built Rochester and you're going to make an economic advances, you're going to have to work at that. And it is constant, ongoing, continuous work. State of New York was the biggest investor in AIM Photonics. We continue to be big investors in the work that's going on. The ability ultimately to build, whether it's integrated circuits or whether it's to build anything that currently uses electronics and to convert those into photons. Speed of photonics, it reduces the size of equipment, miniaturization, less energy used. This has the potential to be breakthrough technology. But with anything, particularly at the early end in terms of development, there are going to be fits and starts. But this has the potential to revolutionize the industry and make Rochester in this region significant benefits over the long term.
Ms. Wilt?
I think that the photonics jobs were primarily aimed at manufacturing jobs, and I think those are not the jobs of the future. I think Rochester does have a rich entrepreneurial base, and part of the problem with funding that entrepreneurial base is that with the repeal of Glass-Steagall, we do not see bank investment in entrepreneurship. We no longer see bank investment in local businesses. Because we've removed that barrier to commercial versus invest in banking, we see banks investing in risky schemes that resulted in the 2007-2008 crash. And we need to have better federal oversight with regard to investment of our dollars.
Ms. Barnhart?
I was there the day Vice President Biden came to Rochester and announced that the Photonics Institute would be here in Rochester. It was just a really wonderful day, and it was sold as a jobs program that day, but what it really is a science program, one that could lead to many jobs here in the future. There is tremendous promise for the optics and photonics companies here in Rochester, and ones that could come here in the future. As your Congresswoman, I will make sure that this program is living up to its promise and that tax dollars are being spent wisely here. The state's investment in photonics, a little more troublesome. I was also there when the governor announced that 2 companies would be coming to Rochester, 2 photonics companies, and they would spend all these millions of dollars. The state would give them all these millions of dollars. Well, it ended up coming here, and I predicted it that day because these companies weren't making anything. So we have to be very careful when we're talking about the corporate welfare for companies that aren't doing anything yet. So we do need oversight on the photonics program, but I believe that it has tremendous promise for the future.
Mr. McFadden?
What I'm hearing today is that people are not connecting the dots between poverty, the working class, and the people that are doing well. Photonics was sold to this community as a job creator. There are people in the working class and poor working class who cannot get these jobs because we have not trained or prepared our workforce to take those jobs. Just like my buddy here, Joe, said, we have the best affordable housing system in the state. Well, we have the worst low-income housing system in the state because you can't find housing for poor people here. We just had a situation where we had the Cadillac Hotel close down and evict illegally a bunch of people. Nobody has stepped up to help those folks out, except for some social agencies. But I would also say this. If we're going to be serious about technology, we have to integrate STEM into education to make sure that all of our children are prepared to take these opportunities when they come. We keep talking about photonics, but there is no investment in building up the infrastructure of our people so they can actually take the jobs.
Thank you, Mr. McFadden. Ms. Wilt, this question is for you, and it's from the League of Women Voters once again. If you were to be elected into Congress, would you vote to impeach President Trump?
If given the opportunity, absolutely. And actually, I think we need to lead on this issue. Right now, we do have people picking up the mantle of holding the president accountable for his misdeeds, and I would utterly be on board with that.
Ms. Barnhart?
I would vote to impeach if there was evidence of crimes and misdemeanors, absolutely, but we need to follow due process and we would need to look at the articles. President Trump, he uses hate to divide us. He governs through chaos and destabilization. And every day I'm scared to look at Twitter to see what he's been up to. And, you know, I have a lot of experience taking on people like Donald Trump who abuse their power. You want me in the ring with Donald Trump. But I will say that Democrats going into the midterm elections and 2020, we're going to have another message besides hating Donald Trump. We're going to have to offer hope and opportunity. We're going to have an economic message. And I hope to be part of those discussions this November and as part of a new Congress.
Mr. McFadden?
I would say this. My opponents are touting themselves to be fighters. I tout myself to be a protector of the voiceless. For me, this isn't about whether or not to impeach Donald Trump, because if we impeach him, Mike Pence is no better than Donald Trump. He might be worse. So we might be careful about what we say we want to do, because we don't want to deal with Mike Pence. Trust me on that. But I will say this. Our citizens deserve elected officials that will go to D.C. not to fight for impeachment, but fight for resources to bring back to our communities. Our people are suffering. The most vulnerable people in our region don't have people who are willing to go to bat for them every day. We have working class folks that are just holding on, wondering, hey, when is my lifeline going to come, because they're a paycheck away from being in the low income class. So we have to get off of this. Can we impeach Donald Trump? We've been talking about it right before he got elected, and he still hasn't been impeached. That's not an issue for me. The issue is who will bring back the resources and exhaust every opportunity to do that.
Mr. Morelli?
Well, I find Donald Trump to be, as I said, the unworthy of the position. His extremist views have damaged America already. I think what we ought to do is make a priority to ensure that the Mueller investigation goes forward unimpeded and that the Congress stand up to make sure that that happens. I also think if there is evidence of treason or misdemeanors under the Constitution, we should certainly act on it. Was very proud of the United States Congress as a teen when I watched the Watergate hearings and watched what Congress did in fulfilling its obligations to oversight. But ultimately, this needs to be decided by the people of the United States. I would much prefer Donald Trump be removed from office in 2020 by virtue of the election of a Democratic president, and I'm going to work very hard to make sure that it happens.
Thank you. Ms. Barnhart, one of your key issues has been campaign finance reform, but what is actually possible in this post-Citizens United world?
Yes, I'm a big believer in campaign finance reform. You know, money flows to power. You can draw direct lines between the checks that donors write and policy. You know, earlier Joe was talking about health care reform. He was one of the only Democrats to vote against the New York Health Act this week. And you know, he gets a lot of money from health insurers and drug companies. That's an example of a line. You know, Citizens United is going to be with us for a bit, but there are things that we can do. We can enact public campaign finance reform, and that should be coupled with independent redistricting. I have voters ask me often about term limits, and when people talk about term limits, what they're really saying is, I feel like I can't have an honest discussion about my elected officials' performance. They're not held accountable because no one can challenge them. They're in these safe gerrymandered districts, and they have these giant war chests, and they don't have to talk to me. By enacting campaign finance reform, giving challengers at least a chance, and having independent redistricting, which will be coming up soon, we're going to force elected officials to talk to you. I'll fight for that, even if it means my neck one day. I will fight for that because it's what we have to do to ensure a more fair and robust democracy.
Mr. McFadden, this question is for you. Since the tax bill, a lot of people out there have seen at least a few extra dollars in their paycheck. You have other people claiming that it is promoting inequality. Where do you stand on the recent tax bill?
I actually think we should repeal the recent tax bill because it's put too much pressure on the working class. Yes, we got a few pennies in our paycheck, but you look at what services we lost in relationship to that. And what does that mean 5, 10 years from now for the working class? Right now, people might be happy with a couple $100s, but we're going to end up paying for it greatly 5, 10, 15 years from now. You got to think about this. We had a $4 trillion budget, almost a $400 billion deficit. Who's paying for that? Who's paying for it? I'll tell you who, the working class. So those folks who are sitting at home looking at their paychecks, wondering what's going to happen to them. Well, that tax break that everyone was touting as being so good isn't working out that way. And we will end up paying for it later.
Mr. Morelli?
Well, I agree with my friend, Mr. McFadden. This is a tax cut which was put in place to help corporate billionaires at a time when the business community is doing very well, part of the Obama expansion, which continues. There was no need, there's no lack of access to capital for corporate operations, and you've seen no jobs come back to the United States as a result of it. What it has done is put more pressure on Social Security and Medicare and other important entitlements, which are now going to be targeted by the same legislators who passed this horrific piece of legislation, because they're going to argue we can't afford programs like Medicare and Social Security. It's a circular argument which they put into place. What we need to do is repeal major portions of this, make sure our entitlement programs are safeguarded, make sure that Social Security is sound for the generation that's coming. Baby boomers, more and more, will head into the age category where they'll be eligible for Medicare and Social Security. I think this was a horrific thing. And not to, aside from even the specifics of it, the process by which they used. After Republicans complained year after year about the work that was done in the Affordable Care Act, et cetera, for them to have passed a bill like this with virtually no consideration, no hearings, no public input is reprehensible.
Ms. Wilt?
I think we need a paradigm shift when it comes to inequality and disparities in income. Right now, we have the greatest disparities in income that we've seen historically. Even in Rochester, we see a tale of two cities. We see extreme want and we see extreme prosperity. And we have a shrinking middle class right now. Part of the reason is our tax structure. So we need to repeal the Trump tax cuts. We also need to implement policies that grow the middle class. Right now we're seeing federal dollars that are spent towards education no longer are greater than those dollars that that colleges bring in from tuition. And that represents a shift that is historic. This is a time when underrepresented communities are entering college at historic proportions, and we no longer have the federal money to expend toward those.
Ms. Barnhart?
The Trump trickle-down tax cut plan did not trickle down. Those plans typically never do. Wages have been flat, but corporations and shareholders, they made out really well. We have to take revenue and invest it in people and invest it in infrastructure. We know jobs will be changing and going away in the future thanks to automation. 80,000 jobs in the Rochester region are at risk of automation, according to a report out this week. We have to figure out what those jobs will be in the future, and we don't know the answer to that question right now, and invest those dollars in our workforce. There's no reason why Rochester shouldn't have the best trained workforce in the country. And we have to invest in infrastructure, roads, bridges, technology, transit, to also make sure that Rochester is the place where companies want to locate, because we have the best workforce and we have the best infrastructure. Now, I can't promise that I'll never vote to cut taxes or never vote to raise taxes. Budget documents need to be looked at in their entirety, but I can promise great oversight on how our tax dollars are used.
The next question is for Assemblyman Joe Morelli. You're elected to Congress and the Democrats take the House, but the Republicans keep the Senate. In this scenario, what do you think that you can actually do to address climate change in a meaningful way?
Well, climate change is one of the most important issues I think faces the planet. A report yesterday by a group of scientists about how quickly the Antarctic is melting and what that will mean in terms of sea levels, et cetera, is enormous. We need to join the Paris Climate Accord once again. And I'd like to think that we'll do the kinds of things that we've been doing in Albany, where we have passed comprehensive climate control measures. We have a standard of a 50% carbon fuel emission reduction by the year 2030. Alternative fuel opportunities, more dollars for green infrastructure. Those are the kinds of things that I'm going to continue to work on as I have done in Albany. I'll take to Washington. And without regard to who I work with, I've had an opportunity to work with Republicans and Democrats as majority leader. I had a series of significant accomplishments, and that's because working across the aisle and finding common ground is going to be critically important. Not giving up your values, but finding common ground and consensus. That's what I've done in Albany. That's what I will do in Washington.
Ms. Wilt.
I too think that climate change is one of the most pressing issues that faces our time right now. And that's why, as a member of the Brighton Town Board, I did sign on to a resolution to encourage our representatives to not only join the Climate Solutions Caucus, which I would join immediately upon being elected to office, but also to invest in green technologies and implement this community choice aggregation, because right now we are facing cataclysmic results of climate change, and we need to do something about it. Sorry.
Ms. Barnhart.
Well, there is a bipartisan group in Congress that is dedicated to solving climate change, the Citizens Climate Lobby, and they are particularly interested in a carbon fee and dividend, where you place a fee on carbon at its source and return those funds to households. I'm just a little concerned. I like the model. In principle, I'm a little concerned that some of the Republicans and energy companies who support this concept also want to couple it with deregulation, such as reducing emission standards on vehicles. I don't think that is a direction that we have to go in. I do support the 100 by 50 Act, getting America to 100% renewable energy by the year 2050. I'm very concerned about the Great Lakes, particularly invasive species and algae blooms. That is something that I believe Republicans would absolutely be willing to work on, because their districts border the Great Lakes, and water is one of our most precious natural resources, and we are so blessed to have that in our Rochester region. Mr.
McFadden.
Well, just as Rachel said, water is one of our most precious resources. When I think about what's going on now, the EPA just eliminated the Clean Water Rule, putting 147 million people at risk. You look at Flint, Michigan today. We can't talk about what we will do until we fix what we have done. Flint, Michigan still doesn't have clean drinking water. You look at the Dakota pipeline that's going on right now, that drilling and the, I would say, the ill that it may cause to the lands that are there and the people that live there, poisoning their drinking water. You think about offshore drilling in the Atlantic Ocean that the EPA is now going to allow. We have to basically look at all of those EPA protections that the Trump administration has taken away, dozens of them, and put them back in before we talk about working with anybody, because those protections were put in for a reason. How can we live in a country like America and know that Flint, Michigan, still does not have clean drinking water? You look at Puerto Rico, they don't have drinking water. All of the things that are happening in a country that's industrialized, that has all of the resources one could imagine, we still can't seem to fix it for our most challenged people. How can we talk about who we're going to work with if we're not willing to fix the mess that we started in the first place?
Thank you, Mr. McFadden. That concludes our debate with the 4 Democratic candidates for the 25th Congressional District seat. The primary, and this is important, it's on Tuesday, June 26th. Polls open at noon. They close at 9. I want to thank once again the League of Women Voters, our audience, and the candidates.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
One last note. One last note. Should you want to watch the debate again or share the video of the whole hour, you'll be able to find it at rochesterfirst.com. At this time, we'd like to thank you once again for watching, and we wish you a good night. Take care.